Any ancient megaproject was defined by its noise. Picture a massive construction site in the ancient Near East, thousands of laborers hauling rock, the constant ring of iron chisels, the cracking of stone, and a dense cloud of dust hanging over it all. But the construction of Solomon's temple operated under a bizarre constraint. According to the historical record in 1 Kings chapter 6, the actual building site had to remain completely silent. The text is highly specific. Neither hammer, nor axe, nor any tool of iron was heard in the house while it was being built. To assemble a structure of this scale without making a sound meant the builders couldn't shape materials on location. They had to rely entirely on an advanced system of off-site prefabrication. Every timber had to be cut to length, and every megalithic stone squared and finished flawlessly, long before they ever reached the assembly zone in Jerusalem. Executing this quiet assembly required Solomon to engineer a sprawling international supply chain, requiring a level of diplomacy and macroeconomic labor management that was highly unusual for the period. Jerusalem sits on a ridge with limited natural resources. It lacked both the high-quality timber and the sheer volume of stone required for a monumental structure, meaning materials had to be sourced from far outside the city limits. Looking at this map of the ancient Levant, we can see how this forced the creation of a massive supply chain spread across 3 distinct logistical zones. First, there was the final assembly node in Jerusalem, where finished components arrived for quiet installation. Second was the resource extraction zone far to the north, in Tyre and the Lebanese mountains, which provided the premium timber. Finally, the broader Israelite territory served as the domestic labor pool required to fuel the operation. Flawlessly synchronizing data, thousands of laborers, and immense volumes of material across these 3 distant nodes was the essential prerequisite to fulfilling the temple promised to David. The temple's internal superstructure required massive spans of cedar and cypress. The scale and density of these ancient cedars made them the absolute premium building material of the region, growing exclusively in the north. Kings in the ancient Near East typically acquired foreign resources in one of 2 ways: by conquering the territory militarily or by extracting heavy taxes from weaker vassal states. Solomon leveraged his father's previous relationship with King Hiram of Tyre to establish a mutual, bilateral commercial treaty instead. The terms were optimized for both economies. Israel utilized its agricultural surplus, exporting huge quantities of wheat and pure olive oil to Tyre annually. In return, Hiram supplied the cedar and, crucially, utilized Tyre's highly advanced maritime transport network to float the timber down the Mediterranean coast on rafts. Trading surplus for surplus, Solomon secured the exact materials he needed and stabilized his northern border, keeping his treasury intact and entirely avoiding a costly resource war. Moving these materials from the coast to the mountain required an immense workforce, beginning with 70,000 conscripted laborers tasked simply with carrying the loads. Added to that were 80,000 dedicated stonecutters working the quarries to shape the raw materials. Managing a sprawling operation of that size demanded strict oversight, requiring 3,300 specialized supervisors. The core administrative challenge detailed in the text was managing the corvée, a mandatory state labor force of 30,000 Israelite citizens, without collapsing the domestic agricultural economy they left behind. Solomon instituted a rotational system, dividing the 30,000 men into 3 groups. One block of 10,000 men was deployed to Lebanon for a 1-month shift. Then they returned home for a 2-month rest phase, while the next group rotated in. This precise 1-to-2 rotation schedule allowed the state to extract massive, continuous labor outputs, while ensuring the men were home often enough to tend their fields and prevent public resentment. While the timber came from the north, the heavy infrastructure required extracting massive foundation stones closer to home. Moving rough boulders is taxing, but transporting fully finished squared stones vastly increases the engineering difficulty. Any chip or fracture during transit ruins the block. The quarrying and finishing processes had to be isolated from the final construction site. Workers spent grueling hours in subterranean environments, carving stones from bedrock. The stonecutters had to measure and shape each block with severe mathematical precision, based entirely on the architect's plans. If a stone arrived at the Temple Mount mismeasured, it was useless. The builders could not strike it with an iron tool to correct the mistake on site. The result of this meticulous prefabrication was a series of flawless dry stone joints. The massive blocks nested perfectly together under their own weight. Accepting the logistical nightmare of transporting fragile, pre-finished megaliths was the strict cost of maintaining the theological silence of the assembly site. Ultimately, all these separate supply lines converged. Tyrian timber and quarried megaliths arrived silently at the Jerusalem Temple Mount, ready to be slotted into place. The driving force behind this entire operation was a strict theological framework, not an architectural preference. God's covenant with David contained an explicit condition. The permanent dwelling place for the divine presence could only be built during a period of absolute geopolitical peace, unassociated with warfare. This era is recognized as the Pax Salomonica. It was a period so defined by stability that Solomon's very name means peace. He achieved this peace by weaponizing commerce, securing regional trade routes, and utilizing hyper-organization instead of deploying armies. The silent construction site was the literal, physical manifestation of that peace. The absence of hammering iron ensured the temple was built entirely devoid of the sounds of war. Looking beyond the physical stones, there is a distinct theological implication regarding King Hiram's integration into the supply chain. The temple was never designed by God to be a closed, insular monument exclusive to Israel. The fact that the foundational materials were cut by Tyrian hands and transported by foreigners prefigured a much wider redemptive scope, actively bringing Gentiles into the construction process. This international cooperation pointed to the ultimate blueprint of redemptive history, that this building was designed to eventually become a house of prayer for all nations. It leaves us with a clear model of how complex systems are actually built. Whether managing a sprawling ancient supply chain or mapping out a theological narrative, the most durable frameworks are forged at the exact intersection of rigid operational constraints and unyielding foundational principles.